Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. I'm Daryl Lim. I serve as Associate Dean for Research and Strategic Partnerships. This series explores leadership through the eyes of judges, lawyers, policymakers, and institution builders as they reflect on their journeys, professional responsibilities, and the lessons they have learned along the way. It's an honor to welcome today's guest, Professor Dermot Groome. He has devoted his career to the pursuit of accountability, truth, and justice in some of the most consequential criminal proceedings of our time. He began his career as a prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office before working internationally on human rights and institutional development. He later served for more than a decade as a senior prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where he led prosecutions involving senior political and military leaders, including Slobodan Milosevic and Ratko Mladic. His work has helped shape modern international criminal law, particularly in areas such as command responsibility, joint criminal enterprise, and the investigation and prosecution of atrocity crimes. At the law school, he directs the International Justice Program and trains and mentors the next generation of lawyers, prosecutors, and human rights advocates. It's a privilege to welcome you to Profiles in Leadership, Dermot.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you for inviting me to be part of your series. It's an honor.
Thank you. Well, let's start at the beginning. Where were you born?
So I was born in New York City, the Upper East Side. My parents are both immigrants. My father was an iron worker, built many of the buildings in Manhattan, and my mother was a homemaker, but also cleaned people's houses. Education was very important for them, and they worked hard to make sure that their five children also all received college educations.
And where did they immigrate from?
Both are from Ireland.
Oh, Ireland. Okay. So, how was it like growing up in a family of five?
It was good. We were a close family. Everyone worked hard. Uh, we moved to Flushing, Queens, so I grew up very close to where the U.S. Open is played now. But I went to high school. All my schooling was in New York, except for law school, where I went to Boston College Law School. But I enjoyed working in New York, and we were all very active in all that happened in New York, particularly in the Irish American community.
So, five children, and you were number what?
I was in the middle, two girls older and two girls younger. So I was in the middle boy.
And they say middle children are especially good at conflict resolution. Do you think that's true?
I just watched my sisters argue about makeup and things, so I felt lucky to be able to avoid some of that.
So you said Boston College, was that because of your Irish roots?
No, it just was, a high ranked school. I had some relatives in Boston, and I just kind of gravitated towards that institution.
What do you remember about your time in law school?
Um, well, I guess it's best said that my former colleagues, my former classmates, are very surprised that I'm a professor now. So I'm not sure whether that reflects on how studious I was, but I very good experience, some great professors, and great opportunities to do. We call it experiential learning now, but to do internships. I did one in a district attorney's office, and I think it helped form my career.
Was there a subject like international criminal law?
I'm sorry?
Was there a subject like international criminal law when you were in
No,
law school?
no. And even today, very few schools have it, even though with all of the international crimes around the world now, to me, I'd love to see more schools offering uh, programs in international criminal law.
And why is that? Law schools tend to be quite responsive to market needs, but in this case, it doesn't seem to be the case.
I think because it's a relatively new field and it's still evolving, so there are not that many people who have the expertise and have actually had some practical experience in doing these cases. The cases I worked on were really the first cases after Nuremberg, the trials after World War II. And there have been a few other tribunals as well. But so still a relatively new field.
What about in Europe and Asia? Do law schools there offer that more frequently?
In Europe, it is more common. I think that's partly their disposition is towards international law and European law. I can't speak with authority about Asian law schools, but I will say that countries like Korea, China, they're very well represented in the field. So some of the most prominent judges and practitioners are from those countries. So I deduce from that that they must have good programs in those countries.
Is there really an international common denominator? You talk about Europe, you talk about uh, Japan, China, Korea, but are countries with very different legal traditions. So how do people with all these different legal traditions come together and say, this is what we agree on?
So that was actually one of the most exciting things about my work in the International Criminal Tribunal. We all grew up and were educated in different legal cultures, and we had some very interesting and vigorous debates about what's the best way to address things like hearsay or indictments, or civil code systems have a completely different way of approaching the truth finding process than us common law lawyers. So I found it very interesting to have those conversations. And I think what we ended up with, we kind of distilled the best of both, of all of these worlds. It's kind of a hybrid model. For any particular point, we would do some kind of comparative study and arrive at what we thought was the best position to take. So I think it's very interesting from a practitioner's point of view. And it also offered great opportunities to interact with colleagues who really saw things differently than I did because they were educated differently. So I guess I also appreciated how much of me was the type of lawyer I was a product of my legal education, not necessarily that it was the way it had to be.
So looking at where the world is right now, do you think we have reached a ceiling as far as how far international criminal law can go, or do you see this just as an inflection point?
I'm very concerned with the state of international criminal law at the moment, particularly with this administration. It issued an executive order at the beginning of the year that really sanctioned people that are supporting international justice. And if you think about it, the qualifications for a senior judge in these tribunals is that you can sit on your country's highest court. So to think that we as Americans or as a country, that really Nuremberg wouldn't have happened without us. The court that I worked for would not have happened. We have been a leader in this field. Now we are leading the attack on it. And the thought that we're sanctioning 80-year-old judges and freezing their bank accounts because they're trying to hold people accountable for international crimes is very sad to me. So I think we're in a point of we're under attack, though the field is under attack. I hope that changes at some point. I hope at some point people realize that long term functioning of an international criminal justice system is essential to peace and security in the world.
So a lot of people ask, and many are surprised about why the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. What do you tell them?
So I think we we signed that treaty, but then we unsigned it. So we signed it during the Clinton administration, and then it was unsigned in the Bush administration. Um, I, I served on a panel of experts convened by the Swiss government to look at the court and how it worked. And so I'd have reservations about the U.S. joining the court now. Uh, I think had the U.S. joined the court at its beginning and assumed the rightful leadership role it would have had, the court would be in a very different place now and would be on a much better path to success. I think many of the problems the court has had has been a lack of support from the United States. So if people ask me, should the U.S. join now? I'd say I think the U.S. should look at it, but I have my own reservations about whether now is the right time for us to join.
What do you think needs to change in order for international criminal law to develop in the way that you think it should?
I think the U.S. I mean, I guess I fought this for a long time, but at the heart of international justice, when we think of our local courts, our expectation is that politics plays no role. Now, it may in one or two cases, and we try to combat that and guard against it. But politics can have a more significant role in international justice than it should. And what the ICC, the International Criminal Court, tried to do was to remove that, but they have not done it successfully, in large part because of the opposition to it by a number of powerful countries. For it to succeed, I think we all need to agree as an international community that the best way forward is to create an independent judicial mechanism, hands off. We hold it to account for the resources that it's given and that it does its work in a fair and impartial way. But everyone sees the value in not trying to politically influence the work of the court.
How much do you think it's a reflection, this move against the ICC is a reflection of a retreat from multilateralism? You see something similar at the WTO, you see the US pulling out of the UN, WHO as well. How do you see this fitting into the broader trend?
I think it's related. I think it's the attack on international judicial institutions started separately, had a separate uh, beginning, but now it's all related. It's the U.S. now is withdrawing from many international organizations. The world order is not like it used to be. I mean, when we look at Ukraine, the Security Council, as part of the United Nations, was established in response to World War II and try to prevent it from happening. And here we have one of the permanent members of the Security Council actually invading another member state. So I'm very concerned that the international order and the peace and security we've benefited from for the last 80 years is under attack. And I'm not sure what will be the end of it. And I'm disappointed that the U.S. isn't doing more to kind of shore it up and defend it, because I think we have benefited from an international order as much as any other country.
Thanks. And definitely want to hear more of your thoughts on what's going on internationally and with international criminal law. But this conversation is equally about you as a person. So let's bring it back to the point that you graduated from law school and you got to decide what you want to do with your life.
So I applied to a number of positions, but I mentioned earlier about my internship at a district attorney's office in Boston. I applied for a position at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. The district attorney at the time was Robert Morgenthau, and he placed a value on finding or hiring young lawyers that grew up in New York City on the belief that they would be more vested in the, you know, doing their jobs well and making the city a safer place. Uh, New York was quite unsafe at the time that I joined the DA's office. Crack had just come on the scene. Places now where people take for granted they can go into day or night, they weren't even safe to go into during the day. So I was attracted to that. When I began to work there, I was shortly after I was made part of the sex crimes unit. It was the first unit of its kind in the United States. And I was really passionate about working with very vulnerable, traumatized victims and helping facilitate their path to achieving justice. So I found I had great colleagues, some of the best lawyers I've ever seen practice. And it was truly a great experience.
Thanks. A few questions to unpack there. So first of all, with the sex crimes unit, do you say that your gender was positive, negative, or it made no difference?
Um, I don't, I could give the whole hour on this. I think, we're trained, and I think the way I liken it, if you go to a doctor and the doctor is a different gender than you, if they're professional, it shouldn't be an impediment. And in some ways, I think the fact that I was a male and many of the victims were female, the fact that a man was expressing outraged at what happened and was taking the lead in getting justice, I think may have contributed to the healing process for some victims. And then also, some of the victims were children, some were male. So I guess the short answer is if you're professional and know how to do your job, it should not have an impact. But of course, if a victim requested a prosecutor of the same gender, we would always honor that.
Do you remember the first case that you were lead counsel on?
Yes, I do actually. It was, and this was a misdemeanor, but it really got my career off to a quick start. There was a newscaster in New York, a very famous one, Katie Chang Lavelle, a very famous newscaster. She's recently retired, but she shows up on the TV once in a while. But her studio was in Rockefeller Center, and there was a man who became obsessed with her. And what he would do he would call in bomb threats to Rockefeller Center, and the whole tower would empty out, and he would be able to see this person he was obsessed with leaving the building. And he did this about 5 or 6 times. So I happened to get the investigation. I worked with police, did voice recognition, charged the person, convicted him. But because of the notoriety of Kaidi Chung Lavelle, it really moved my career forward very quickly.
Did you get to know her as an individual through that work?
Yes, so I interviewed her and spoke with her. He ultimately pled guilty on the eve of trial, so she did not testify. But
Yes. Uh, How was it like working with vulnerable individuals? That's not something I think that we talk about often as part of our training in law school and speaking to law school students about that. So how did you pick up those skills?
working with more senior prosecutors that that had more experience and particularly with the types of victims. Uh, Morgenthau had this system of called vertical prosecution. He thought the best thing for a victim was the first prosecutor you meet is the same prosecutor who does the trial. Now, of course, that puts prosecutors in situations where they may not have all the experience that they should have, but he was very good at making sure you were surrounded with the experience that you needed to support you through that process. So very early on, I was working with victims of very serious crimes, but had the support of really good colleagues who really knew how to deal with these witnesses. And in time, I learned those skills as well.
So at some point you decided, well, it was time to move on. Uh, how did you get to that point and how did you decide where to go next?
So about 4 or 5 years as a prosecutor, I had a number of really difficult sex crimes cases involving children. And at that time, I was doing some work on housing issues in my spare time in New York City, the Lower East Side. And there was a hurricane in Jamaica. And I went to Mr. Morgenthau and asked, could I have a year sabbatical to go down and try to start a nonprofit to rebuild houses in the hurricane? He agreed to that. I went down, I spent a year there, and we built about 45 houses and taught people how to build houses and provided them the tools. The Canadian government funded that. Um, During that time, there was a children's home. It was a religious order that had two children's homes. Um, One of the nuns asked me to help out with some problems they had, some leaks in the roof and some other issues. And my future wife happened to be working at one of those schools, and we met. Um, so I returned to well, I guess I should say this. In that first year, when I was there, 3 children died at the school. And one child actually died in my arms, Gary Sins. And it really was kind of an epiphany for me, because this was the first time I worked outside the United States, that, there were children in the school that were smarter than me, worked harder than me, but because of the color of my skin and where I was born, I had advantages that they did not. So, and that's something I've carried throughout my life. And even up until the law school, where after the murder of George Floyd, I started the Race and Equal Protection of the Laws program. So I returned to the DA's office, tried to do fundraising, tried to help the school. They, after about a year and a half, said, "Would you please come back? We have some serious problems we think you can help us solve." So I did go back, and I worked for 5.5 years in Jamaica. Some of the best work that I've done, and I'm still in regular contact with these people who have become lifelong friends. So did that, and then at that stage, when I finished up at Jamaica, um, the war in Yugoslavia was underway, and to me, it seemed like that was the best work that a prosecutor could do. Uh, while in Jamaica, I was asked to get involved in a couple of investigations into deaths in the prison system. Um, and I came to appreciate the value of human rights and the importance of lawyers advocating for the human rights of people that might be incarcerated or might be in foster care. And so I guess that began my journey to try to contribute in the form of human rights work.
So I want to go back to what you said about housing. And we read about tragedies and calamities all the time in the newspaper. What was it about housing that tugged at your heartstrings and just made you decide that was something you wanted to invest in?
I guess, working in New York City in Manhattan, I was intimately familiar with all of its neighborhoods, the wealthy ones that people know around Central Park, but also the ones that had high crime and had a lot of poverty. And to me, it seemed to me that every family deserves to raise their children in a safe, healthy environment. And there were pockets of New York City that were not like that. So the project that I got involved in was with Habitat for Humanity, and we restored a 6-story walk-up tenement that had fallen into disrepair and worked with families that they contributed their own sweat and work to it. And eventually it housed something like 30 families at the end of it. So I saw that as a really good way of addressing homelessness and poverty in the city. And there's another project that I worked on and started with a colleague in Manhattan where we went block by block, the drug blocks, where and tried to deal with the other community problems that contributed to the drug trade. So we might do an investigation and take out the drug dealer, but we also worked with the parks department to make sure the park was secured at night. We made sure that there was increased police presence at certain times of the day when people were picking up their children up from school and things like that to try to make the areas safer.
So when you try to get funding for your housing work, you mentioned that you got the funding from the Canadian government. Why not the local authorities or national authorities?
In Jamaica, where
Yep.
I mean, it was just hit with one of the worst hurricanes, Hurricane Gilbert. And Jamaica is a poor country, so it was certainly beyond its ability to fund. I mean, it was doing something. But the projects Jamaica was funding had more to do with infrastructure. There was a dam that was damaged in the roads. So it was actually the Canadian government that I had sent some letters out about my interest, and they contacted me and they said, "Look, we want to fund a project in Jamaica to rebuild houses, and we want to talk about you leading it." So that's how that happened.
So you finished that. You did mention Yugoslavia, but there was also Cambodia. Was Cambodia before or after Yugoslavia?
It was before.
Yeah, so that placed you at the center of some real-time human rights crisis, including the 1997 grenade attack on government workers and reporting to the UN Security Council. Talk about your experience working on that.
So I was legal advisor for the International Human Rights Law Group based in Washington. And went to Cambodia. I ultimately spent about 3 years there, but I was to do some training in human rights. I was also to visit prisons and do assessments, and then also monitor court proceedings. Um, while I was there was this terrible attack on a group of women that were garment workers, and they were trying to petition the parliament for better pay. One of the people speaking to them was a man by the name of Sam Rainsy, who was running in opposition to the Prime Minister Hun Sen. And motorcycles came by and just lobbed grenades into the group, trying to kill Sam Rainsy. He survived, but I forget the exact number, but there was, I think, 16, 18 women died and scores were injured. Um, the UN had a presence there, the High Commission of Human Rights, but did not have the skills to investigate a crime like that. So they had heard of me and asked me would I work with their staff to conduct that investigation, which I did. I wrote a report. Thomas Hammenberg was the special rapporteur on Cambodia at the time, and he presented my report to the Security Council.
And what happened after that?
So Cambodia has a long and tortured history. Um, Not specifically that crime, but for crimes committed by the Khmer Rouge, there was a long period of negotiation with the Cambodian government to establish a tribunal for accountability of the Khmer Rouge for the crimes committed um, during their occupation or their regime. The Secretary General picked me to be the co-prosecutor, the international prosecutor of that institution. I respectfully declined because when I reviewed the agreement that the UN had drafted with Cambodia, and knowing what I knew about Cambodia, I did not think that I had the authority that I would need to discharge my duties. They had made too many compromises, and I think my concerns proved true. There were some successful prosecutions, but much of the court's work has been mired in log jams and disagreements and disputes of authority between the international component of the court and the national component.
Do you think that's a systemic failure with trying to get international justice, with so many of the people who potentially would benefit from the dysfunction remaining in power?
Yes, I mean, I think any of these people who are responsible for crimes will do everything they can to prevent or impede being held, themselves being held accountable. I mean, Hun Sen only left power just a few years ago, and now his son is in power. So he's had power in Cambodia for a very long time. And having worked in this system and knowing some of the problems and some of the problems occasioned by Hun Sen, I knew from when I read the agreement that Cambodia, Hun Sen got the better deal. He negotiated the better agreement, and I think he knew at the time he signed it, he knew that he could impede the work of the tribunal, which he worked very hard to do.
Did you feel, before we close off the chapter about your time in Cambodia, did you feel that you got the kind of justice that you had hoped to get for the garment workers?
Um, no, because no one was ultimately prosecuted. I was able to establish that the people who threw the hand grenades were the personal bodyguards of Hun Sen, but I was not able to establish that last link between that he ordered it or anything like that. So, and there was no. This is before the International Criminal Court existed. There was no ad hoc court for Cambodia, so there was really no place to get justice for those people, which is unfortunate for sure.
Uh, Let me ask you one quick follow-up question. Uh, People who have been following the news would have seen that the former president of the Philippines is now in custody and awaiting trial. I think uh, there were many allegations against him, and for a long time, people thought that this would just be another strong man that would fall through the cracks. What do you think made a difference there? Is there something that we can learn in bringing perpetrators who are in positions of power to justice?
So, interestingly, on that case, proceedings just concluded on one important juncture of the case yesterday. So yesterday, the confirmation of charges hearing was completed. There are some examples of heads of states that have been held to account. When I was investigating Milosevic, I never thought that we actually would get him. No one thought we would actually get him. But we prepared our case and did our jobs. And, I guess I had hoped that at least we'd preserve for history his crimes. But things changed and we did get him. We ultimately did get him. And there must be about 6 different presidents who have now been brought before courts and been held to account. It still is an uncommon occurrence. I think it happened in Duarte's case because there was a critical mass of countries in the international community that supported it. We see the opposite with some other world leaders at the moment, where there's really opposition for them being held to account or to go before the court and answer the charges levied against them. But it's certainly my hope that one day it will happen often enough that a person in a position of power pauses before they order the commission of grave crimes and says, there's a high likelihood I could be held to account for this crime that I'm planning, and that it deters them from doing so. So that is my hope.
Thanks. So let's talk about Yugoslavia. You spent more than a decade as a senior prosecutor at the ICTY, and you led prosecutions uh, with some really high-profile people. In fact, a movie at least has been, maybe more than one. Other feature films and documentaries have been made about your work there. Talk to us about those years and some takeaways uh, from your experience as a prosecutor.
So it was one of the most professionally satisfying experience of my professional career. Very important work. Victims that suffered some of the most grave crimes ever perpetrated, and working in an environment, and I don't mean just the prosecutors, but the judges and the defense counsel, everyone had a sense that we were doing something really important. This was the first time since or after Nuremberg that we were going to attempt to do this in a more regular and sustainable manner. It was a great environment to work in, to work with lawyers from all around the world. It was really the honor of my life to work with some of these victims that had suffered so terribly and to help them uh, tell their story and seek justice. Um, it was it made a strong impression on me that some of these people that had lost everything, maybe several members of their family, their homes, their livelihoods, everything, the one thing they had left was the truth and the importance of telling it. And so it was inspiring to see them. And I know how difficult it was in some cases. Um, but it was awe-inspiring to see those victims come forward. And if I can just tell a quick little story, this was all kind of made very real to me, and what we can do as lawyers and the important role we play in society. There was one woman who had been raped repeatedly over the course of a week by this person by the name of Milan Lukic, who was considered to have killed the most people and raped the most people with his own 2 hands in the course of the war. And when she came to testify, and there's a whole story about the challenges she faced to do that, when I asked her to look around the courtroom, because she knew him, they went to high school together, to look around the courtroom and tell the court whether she recognized anyone, she looked around, and when she saw him, she stood up, got out of the witness box, walked towards him, pointed to him, and it said, "You did all this to me." And he goes, "Look at me. I want to look at you in the eyes." And he was cowering. I looked at him, and he was cowering, staring at the faces at the desk. His hands were trembling, and I thought, wow. I mean, I just appreciated the law and courts, and in a whole different way. That here, perhaps the most traumatized person that I had ever worked with was now standing up to one of the worst people I've ever prosecuted. He was cowering, and she was in a position of power. So yeah, so it was a great place to work, and it really was very fulfilling as a lawyer to engage in that work as long as I
Well,
could.
what do you think enabled her to do that, to make that recovery and transformation?
It's what the court means to what the court meant to her. That this was her ability to confront this terrible suffering. He also killed members of her family. Um, there was a value, an intrinsic value in being able in this venue. She knew she was going to be safe in that venue, but still to confront the person who caused you and your family so much harm, to be able to stand up and point them out, and then to speak honestly and clearly and about the crimes that he perpetrated against her. It was certainly the most powerful moment that I've ever witnessed as a lawyer, and I'm proud and honored to be part of to be a lawyer, because we get to do this if we're lucky, and just a legal system where we create the opportunities and the places where victims can come and seek justice.
For the benefit of viewers that may not be familiar with what went on in Yugoslavia, can you give us the context from your perspective about some of the factual, the political causes for this? What were some of the things that the ICTY was particularly interested in? And also, how do you deal with the perhaps accusation that it's really figurehead justice and it's not really possible to go after every single perpetrator, and you pick and choose a few and you say we have done our work.
Okay, so your first question, I mean, it's a very complex um, uh, situation, but at the risk of leaving out important parts, after World War II, Yugoslavia was formed out of 6 different republics that were held together by Marshal Tito, a communist leader. Um, in the 80s, some of these countries decided that, or began to think, that they'd be better off independent. In the early 90s, some of those countries made moves for independence, declared their independence, and the ethnic makeup of Yugoslavia was very integrated. So if you looked at Bosnia, where most of my work focused, there were very large, significant populations of Serbs. They were Orthodox Christians, Croats, mostly Catholic, and Bosniak, mostly Muslims, but all intermingled in a way that you really could not just redraw boundaries and let everyone live with with their own ethnicity. And in that, what happened was Milosevic came up with a plan to ethnically cleanse parts of Bosnia. It ultimately ended up in genocide in Srebrenica and crimes against humanity in the rest of the country. So that's a really kind of a short version of what happened. As to your second question about, so my court was established in 1993 by the Security Council under its authority and responsibility to preserve peace and security. And the idea was, because of this complex situation of Yugoslavia, no country, even though we saw a genocide taking place, no country wanted to go send their troops in to try to stop that. And of course, after World War II, we promised ourselves never again. We'd never let another genocide. So this diplomatic solution was, let's create a court. And if that court could focus on the most senior people and hold them accountable, that might help restore peace and security. So if all the leaders behind these different crimes, if they could be brought before a court, might contribute to peace and justice and peace and security. So that was our mandate from the beginning, and we did that, but very conscious of your point that there are so many perpetrators. Are we just picking a few from the top? And so also part of our mandate was to work with local prosecutors, help train them, and then help them by providing evidence that we gathered in our investigations. And that was an important part of my job. So without going into great detail, the results, any good evidence that we were able to get and we thought was relevant to the work of local prosecutors in Serbia, in Bosnia, in Croatia, we provided that and tried to support them in their fledgling efforts to do international justice.
And did you know that you'd be there for 10 years?
Um, no, I did not. I did not expect that I would be there that long. Um, but yeah, I have no regrets about being there that long. I think I have been very privileged to have the opportunity to work on some of the important cases I worked on, and to then also have the privilege of working with some of these victims who, again, I'm awe inspired by their courage, their tenacity, and their unquenchable desire for justice. It really, yeah, it inspires me.
I'm going to ask you in a few minutes about a couple of legal doctrines that you helped to really develop. But before that, question about how your family and you navigate these types of placements, 10 years in one place in Cambodia. They travel there with you?
So both of my children were born. I wasn't married in Cambodia. I was married when I went to the Netherlands. We had my wife Mag and I had both of our children. They were born in the Netherlands, um, and they grew up for a substantial part of their childhood there. And then after my work at the tribunal, I came to Pennsylvania, which none of us had any connection to, but we have, yeah, we love the community that we lived in Pennsylvania. Um, but I mean, I think it's enriched my children. Um, their classmates were from all over the world. They went to an international school, so yeah, they were always immersed in a tremendously diverse group of friends and classmates, which I think has greatly enriched them.
Thanks. So talk to us about joint criminal enterprise and command responsibility.
So, first, talk about joint criminal enterprise. So, when I was asked to take over the Milosevic investigation, um, and as I learned about the evidence we were collecting, I mean, the statute had that the Security Council passed had some very clear ways of that someone could be guilty of a crime by ordering it, by planning it, by directly committing it. And when I got to know the evidence, I didn't think that Milosevic pulled the trigger. I didn't think that he planned the murders that happened in a particular place. And so, in struggling to how to conceptualize how a senior leader is responsible, around that same time, the 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 appeals chamber in the ICTY issued its decision in the Tadich case. And the Tadich case was essentially five low level perpetrators that had gone in, committed some murders, and the trial court had acquitted them, saying that the evidence didn't establish who did what. And in our system, a trial judgment can be reversed by an appeals judgment. So when the appeals chamber looked at it, it did a review of all of the Nuremberg cases and focused on this concept in the Nuremberg tribunal, common purpose doctrine, which said basically, in its simplest form, that if a group of people share the intent to commit crimes and all contribute to it, it's not as important to know who did what, who pulled the trigger on victim A and who actually pulled the trigger on victim B. If you could establish that those victims were killed by this group of people and they shared the intent to do it, then Tadic was convicted. And that happened as I arrived at the tribunal, and I'm struggling with how to look at, conceptualize Milosevic, um, culpability. And as the chief prosecutor recounts in her biography, I walked in one day with a memo saying, I think this is the answer. That Milosevic, he's sharing the intent to ethnically cleanse Bosnia. He is supplying the funds and the resources to do it. In certain occasions, he's actually being very specific about what he wants done. but he's not directly involved in the specific crimes. And one of the concepts in joint common purpose doctrine, which was then, now it's commonly referred to as joint criminal enterprise, is that you're also responsible for the crimes that are foreseeable. In other words, if Milosevic says, I want to ethnically cleanse all the Muslims out of Eastern Bosnia, that those people aren't going to leave peacefully the land that they've occupied for generations. And in ethnically cleansing them, you're going to have to kill some of them. And that's foreseeable. And under joint criminal enterprise, those foreseeable crimes are also the person in that joint criminal enterprise can be culpable. It's very similar to our Pinkerton doctrine.
Thanks. You want to say anything about command responsibility?
So command responsibility, I haven't made any tremendous contribution to its development. It has been an important legal principle that I have used and relied on in many of my cases. And essentially, what command responsibility says is that, look, we are going to give, if we give commanders, or we do give military commanders and political commanders of militaries, tremendous power to take human life on a large scale and to destroy property on a large scale. And to balance that, we are going to hold them responsible for crimes committed by their subordinates over which they have effective control and for which they know that these subordinates are committing these crimes and they decide they're not going to punish them, or they know that they're about to commit those crimes and they don't prevent it. So even though they have no direct involvement in that crime, they will be treated as if they themselves committed the crime if it was committed by a subordinate over whom they had effective control and they knew that these crimes are being committed. So it's a way of balancing this tremendous authority we give commanders.
And that's a great way to put it. Talk about how that relates to your training of Ukrainian prosecutors. How did you even begin with this work of training Ukrainian prosecutors?
So after the invasion in February, which is February 22, a former colleague of mine, Ambassador Clint Williamson, he works for the State Department, and asked me that President Biden wanted to send over some people with experience in investigating war crimes to support prosecutors in Ukraine. So Ukraine has, several thousand prosecutors. They know how to prosecute domestic crimes, but not large-scale atrocity crimes and not international crimes. So my first visit was in April 22 with Ambassador Williamson. I've been there 4 times. And for much of that time, it's been to train them on the law, international crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, train them on how to investigate these large, complex crimes. And part of that, particularly in the last few months, has involved me working with them on command responsibility. Just recently, their parliament adopted that as a mode of liability into their criminal code. And I've been working with them. So, in fact, this Wednesday and Thursday, I'm training judges in the western part of the country on these principles and how are the elements of command responsibility, which I've described before, how are they established by evidence? So to train them and so they can begin to start applying the law that they've now passed.
So you gave a presentation about your work in Ukraine to our community at Penn State Dickinson Law. I remember one anecdote you shared was how the people that you were training were so dedicated that even what with bombs going off above head, they were still in the bunkers and still in the basements, connected with you electronically. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I approached Dean Conway when the war started, and I was teaching international criminal law in the spring. Oh, I'm sorry, this was, I think, the fall of 22. And I had begun to work with Ukrainian prosecutors. And I asked her how she felt about allowing some of the more senior prosecutors to take my class through Zoom. And she was extremely supportive, to her credit. And so that fall, I had, I think, 8 senior Ukrainian prosecutors on Zoom. I had my regular 10, 12 students in person in my class, and they were taking the course together. Uh, I don't know this for sure, but I'm sure some of my students, it was an early morning class, or were like, oh, I have to get up early for Groome's class. But there were several times when the Ukrainian prosecutors were on the video when the alarms went off, the air raid sirens went off, and we could see them run down with their computers, watching the class, watching the last lecture, and still trying to participate. It made a strong impression on me. I think it made a very strong impression on the students. And one of the requirements for the course is to do a case study. And I paired up the Ukrainian prosecutors with our students. And I think that was a very enriching student experience for both Ukrainian prosecutors, but particularly for our students to work with these people who are living in such adverse conditions and trying to do their jobs as lawyers.
Thanks. Uh, I want to be respectful of your time. I do have a few more questions. Is that okay if we go five
Sure.
minutes up over the hour? Okay.
Sure.
I want to ask you about your work on authenticated video archives. And you talk about the importance of truth, and you've been focused on that with the European Broadcast Union's Ukraine Archive. Tell us about why that's important.
So to me, I see so in my work in Yugoslavia, I was able to find with an investigator a very important piece of video evidence. It was the killing of men at Srebrenica. So I really appreciated the importance of video, but it was very hard to find in that context. So I thought, well, everyone's got a camera now that takes video, but there's a lot of junk out there. It can't meet the requirements of admission into a courtroom. Um, but then the European Broadcast Union, and they're a conglomerate of like public broadcast stations in Europe, like RTE and BBC. And they approached me and said, look, we take a lot of video in Ukraine. Um, are there ways that we can contribute to international justice with it? And I said, yes. And let's develop a system where we can capture the information that's going to be needed for court. We can put it in a searchable index where investigators around the world looking at these cases through the principle of universal jurisdiction can access it and then hopefully use it as evidence in cases in the ICC or in national jurisdictions under the concept of universal jurisdiction, which is something I'm working on now, universal jurisdiction.
Is this something that you're seeing more widely used, given all the many different crackdowns, whether it's in Iran or whether it's in other parts of Asia or Europe, where
It's
there's a partnership between the media and international justice or even local justice?
I think there's a gap there now, and I think there's this great reservoir of reliable evidence. We need to build the infrastructure so that it can make its way uh, into a court and establish its authenticity. And this has become particularly important in the last year, where we see AI generated videos. So it's going to be extremely critical for judges to have the information they need to make a determination that whatever is depicted in the video, which is the best evidence, is also authentic.
So let's talk about the next generation, and that's really where I think you focus a lot of your work too while you're in Pennsylvania. Uh, you've helped oversee the International Justice Program, and you have created opportunities for our students to spend time in The Hague. Uh, and you also have run international trial ad programs inside ICC courtrooms where our students have been able to participate. So talk to us about building that type of an experience for students and why that's important.
So myself, Professor Gilden has created one of the best trial advocacy programs in the country. And him and I had this idea, why don't we adapt this to international trials? And we did that. And we developed a very detailed case study or case workbook with a number of students. And we went over to The Hague and for 2 years and did extensive training with practitioners there. As far as the International Justice Program, that's a program that I've run for 20 years now. Even when I was working doing these cases, I was an adjunct at the law school and was administering this program. And it gives students the opportunity to go work in these international courts. So we've had many students that have gone through the program, and they have worked on some of the most important cases in history. So this semester, Kelsey Montier, she's a third year student, she's in The Hague now, and she was working at the conclusion of a trial against the former president of Kosovo. A terribly consequential and important case. It's been a tremendous experience for her. She's been watching the closing arguments. She's been helping develop the response with the prosecutors. So it's a great opportunity to get involved in high level work, learn a new area of law, but then also interact on a day to day basis with lawyers from all over the world. So it's been a great program. Unfortunately, I'm ending it now. It's just our students are exposed to, with the executive order making it a crime or to support the International Criminal Court. I think we're just our students are becoming too vulnerable for the repercussions that we're not really sure what they are yet. So with my impending retirement and this executive order, after long discussions with the administration of the school, we've decided to end the program.
So I'm going to want to end on a note of hope and talk to us about how viewers who are listening to this can support, can galvanize, can catalyze the kind of work that you have dedicated your life to, notwithstanding the current headwinds that we are facing in looking at the next 10 years. How can we turn the tide and make international criminal law, international justice a reality?
I think it's unreasonable for me to think that students are likely, or many students are likely, to go into this field. It's kind of a hard field to get into now, particularly with the fact that it's under attack. But to try to support it, to appreciate that our peace and security, our way of life, depends upon the rule of law and our international system of rules, and that has to be enforced and supported through international judicial institutions. For those students, and there are students who have gone on, there's a student, Michelle Churchley, who has made a career. She's a graduate from our law school. She lives in The Hague, and for the last, I think, 15 years, she's been working in the international one of the international courts, and has had a great career. So there are some students, and I encourage them to explore it. And of course, if I can support students in that quest with that aspiration, I'm always happy to do it.
Thank you. Well, David, it only leaves me to give the final thought to you, just to sum up and share any closing remarks that you might have with our viewers.
So I think in the questions you sent me, any advice, and I thought there's advice that I have from two sources. One is when I was a 11-year-old paper boy, a woman befriended me and said, "Look at your life in 5-year increments," and I've done that. And her view was, in 5 years you probably have contributed what you can, and you've learned what you can, and be open to new opportunities. And I've kind of done that if you look over the course of my career. So I always say to students that are looking for advice, you don't have to plan your entire legal career. Find something where you can constructively contribute for the next 5 years. And then the second piece of advice is from the Old Testament. It's from Micah chapter 6, verse 8. And it says, "All that is required of you is to do justice, love with kindness, and walk humbly with your God." And that's been something that I have been important. I think about often as I do my work. We live in a complex world, but if we as lawyers can do justice and love with kindness, I think we can make a very, very important contribution. And I think we are in a difficult time in this country, and I think it's going to be good lawyers that help us navigate our way to a better day for our country and the world.
Well, thank you for sharing that timeless wisdom for us to close our conversation on. Thank you for this very thoughtful and deeply meaningful conversation. We at the law school certainly deeply appreciate your leadership, your example, and your continued contributions to this institution and to the profession. And we certainly look forward to keeping in touch. So thank you for joining us on this episode of Profiles in Leadership.
Thank you, Daryl, for having me. Have a good day.